An abridgment of Thomas Manton's commentary on the Epistle of James, chapter 4, verse 15. James 4, verse 15 presents a profound corrective to the arrogance and self-sufficiency addressed in the previous verse. Here, the apostle writes, "Instead you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that." This single verse is a wellspring of theological richness, calling believers to a life of submission, humility, and acknowledgement of divine sovereignty. In it, James not only exposes the error of presumption, but also provides a framework for a life lived in the awareness of God's providence and our own frailty. The phrase, "if it is the Lord's will," captures the essence of the Christian life, a life lived in conscious dependence on God. James is not merely recommending a verbal formula, but is advocating for a heart posture. The believer must acknowledge God's sovereign authority over every aspect of existence, our life, our actions, and the outcomes of our plans. To say, "if it is the Lord's will," is to confess that we are not masters of our destiny. Our very breath, our strength to act, and the success of our endeavors are entirely contingent on God's good pleasure. This acknowledgement of divine will is not limited to the religious or extraordinary. James applies it to the most mundane aspects of life. Whether we live, travel, or conduct business, all must be done in recognition of God's sovereignty. The words, "we will live and do this or that," emphasize that even the basic fact of our continued existence is subject to God's will. The Apostle Paul echoes this truth in Acts 17, verse 28. "For in him we live and move and have our being." The habit of reverent speech. James's instruction also encourages the habitual use of language that reflects our dependence on God. To say, "if it is the Lord's will," is not merely a pious cliché, but a means of cultivating reverence and mindfulness. Words shape thoughts, and habitual expressions of submission can train the heart to rest in God's providence. As believers, our lips should reflect the holiness of our hearts. This is a powerful witness to the world, contrasting sharply with the arrogance of self-sufficiency that characterizes those without God. Scripture offers many examples of this practice. Paul frequently expressed his plans with the caveat of God's will. "I will come to you very soon, if the Lord is willing," 1 Corinthians 4, verse 19. "I hope to spend some time with you, if the Lord permits," 1 Corinthians 16, verse 7. Even the light of nature led pagans like Socrates to advise, "Before every work you must say, 'if God will.'" These examples remind us that this practice is deeply rooted in both divine revelation and the universal recognition of human dependence. However, James's exhortation is not limited to verbal expressions. The heart must accompany the tongue. As Augustine warns, "Do not learn to have in your hearts what everyone has in his tongue." Mere repetition of the phrase without genuine reverence reduces it to an empty formula. True submission involves aligning the heart and mind with the reality of God's sovereignty, whether or not the phrase is explicitly spoken. The practical implications of submission. Submitting our plans to God's will involves more than just words. It requires a fundamental orientation of life. First, we must align our actions with God's revealed will, as found in Scripture. The psalmist writes, "Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light for my path." Psalm 119, verse 105. Plans that contradict God's commands are doomed to fail, for they lack His blessing. Second, submission requires seeking God's guidance in prayer. Abraham's servant prayed for success before seeking a wife for Isaac, Genesis 24, verse 12, and David frequently inquired of the Lord before taking action, 1 Samuel 30, verse 8. When we neglect to seek God's direction, we risk acting in pride and inviting unnecessary frustration and failure. Third, submission involves a readiness to accept God's providence, whether it aligns with our desires or not. Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane models this perfectly. "Not as I will, but as you will," Matthew 26, verse 39. This is the posture of a heart that trusts God's wisdom and goodness even when His will is difficult to bear. The sovereignty of providence and the frailty of life. James's exhortation also rests on two foundational truths: the sovereignty of God and the frailty of human life. God, as the supreme lawgiver and ruler, directs all things according to His will. Proverbs 16 verse 9 reminds us, "In his heart a man plans his course, but the Lord determines his steps." No plan, no matter how carefully devised, can succeed without God's blessing. This truth humbles us and compels us to seek His favor in all our endeavors. The frailty of human life further underscores the need for dependence on God. Our lives are like a vapor, fleeting and fragile, as James notes in the following verse. Psalm 146 verse 4 starkly reminds us, "When their spirit departs, they return to the ground. On that very day their plans come to nothing." Recognizing this reality should lead us to humility, gratitude, and a sense of urgency to live for God's glory. A call to trust and rest. Finally, James's words call us to a life of trust and rest in God's providence. When we commit our plans to Him, we are freed from the anxiety of outcomes. We can work diligently and plan wisely, knowing that the ultimate result is in His hands. This trust allows us to face setbacks with peace, recognizing that God's purposes are always good and His wisdom is unsearchable. In conclusion, James 4 verse 15 is a timeless call to humility, reverence, and dependence on God. It challenges the arrogance of self-reliance and invites us into the peace of trusting the One who holds all things in His hands. By submitting our plans to God's will, we honor His sovereignty, acknowledge our dependence, and align our lives with His purposes. This is not merely a religious duty, but the path to true freedom and joy in the Lord. May we, like James, learn to live and speak with the constant awareness that all things are subject to the will of our gracious and sovereign God.